That night changed me, not because of what happened. It was just another evening, like many before it. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the streets had quieted down, as most people began their usual evening routines. The world around David felt like it was on pause, an endless loop of the same events unfolding day after day. He woke up, went to work, met a few friends, and did it all over again. It wasn't a bad life, not at all. But something inside him told him that it wasn't enough. He had everything he needed: good friends, a steady job, a roof over his head, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was a sense of yearning that he couldn't quite name, the kind of feeling that gnawed at you quietly in the middle of a busy day or just before bed, when the world went still. Tonight was supposed to be no different. He had made plans with a couple of old friends to catch up over drinks at a local bar. It was nothing extravagant, just a casual hangout, like they always did. He had almost forgotten about the heaviness in his chest. Maybe the laughter and light-hearted chatter would clear it away for a while. When he arrived at the bar, his friends were already there, sitting around a worn wooden table near the window. The place was small, dimly lit, with just enough buzz to keep it lively, but not too crowded. The familiar smell of food, stale beer, and wood filled the air. There were moments when David could almost feel like he was slipping into the background of this place, like he was invisible, not because of any actual reason, but because he didn't quite belong. His friends were joking, talking about their latest adventures, and all David could do was nod and smile. He didn't feel connected, at least not the way he used to. It was a strange feeling, really. He loved these friends, and they loved him. Yet, for some reason, it felt like the spaces between them were widening, each conversation more about keeping up appearances than genuinely connecting. He found himself glancing around the room, watching the people around him, their laughter echoing in the air. But none of it seemed to reach him. "Are you okay, David?" one of his friends asked, pulling him back into the moment. David blinked and looked at her, trying to shake the fog that had settled in his mind. Yeah, I'm fine, just tired, I guess." But that wasn't entirely true. It wasn't exhaustion from work or late nights. It was something deeper, a restless feeling that had been growing inside him for a while. His friend raised an eyebrow, but didn't push any further, instead returning to the conversation. David took a long sip of his drink, the cold liquid sliding down his throat, momentarily numbing the thoughts racing through his head. It was nothing new, this sense of being lost, of being stuck in a loop that felt too tight. But for some reason, tonight, it felt heavier. It almost felt as though something was pressing against his chest, holding him there, making it hard to breathe. They talked for a while, reminiscing about old times, cracking jokes about things that had happened years ago. Laughter filled the air, and David couldn't help but smile at their antics. But inside, he still felt distant. He couldn't shake the thought that there was more out there, something just beyond his reach. He wanted more, but he didn't know what that more was. The evening wore on, and eventually, his friends began to leave. The bar was quieter now, only a few patrons lingering behind. David's eyes wandered again, this time landing on a stranger sitting alone at the bar. There was nothing remarkable about the person, just a quiet individual nursing a drink, lost in thought. David stood up, feeling the weight of the evening settling into his bones. He said his goodbyes and walked out into the night. The cool air hit his face, and for a brief moment, he felt alive. But as he walked to his car, that gnawing feeling returned, that strange, empty feeling that was always there, waiting. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the sound of the car filling the silence. The streets were empty now, save for a few cars and the occasional passerby. He couldn't help but wonder how long he'd been walking through life without truly seeing it. The night wasn't special, not by any means. It was just another night. But it felt different somehow. The familiar routine seemed dull in comparison to the swirling thoughts that had begun to fill his mind. It wasn't just about wanting a change. It was about needing one. The realization hit him like a wave, a quiet storm in the back of his mind. He didn't know what was next, but he knew that something had to change. Something in him had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of possibility. David spent the next few days in a haze of confusion. The thought of change, of something different, lingered in the back of his mind. He couldn't focus at work, couldn't shake the feeling that he was moving through life on autopilot. It wasn't the work itself that bothered him. It was the fact that he was doing it without truly being present. He showed up every day, did what was expected of him, and went home. There was no passion behind it, no fire. He tried to ignore it at first, telling himself that he was just going through a phase, that everyone felt this way sometimes. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't a phase. This was something deeper, something that had been building for years. The realization hit him again as he sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen, the hours slipping away in a blur. It wasn't that he disliked his job, or the people he worked with. In fact, he got along well with everyone, and his work was good. But the feeling of fulfillment was missing. There was no sense of purpose, no connection to the bigger picture. His life felt fragmented, as though he were simply playing a part in someone else's story. David had always prided himself on being practical. He had always taken the safe route, the one that made sense. He had followed the path that was laid out for him, one step at a time, without questioning it. But now, for the first time, he wondered if that was enough. Was playing it safe really enough? Was being comfortable enough? He didn't think so anymore. On his lunch break, he found himself walking through the park, the same park he had passed by every day for years. The leaves rustled in the trees, and a gentle breeze brushed against his face. It was peaceful here, but even in the tranquility, something felt off. He watched families stroll by, laughing and talking, and he felt a pang of envy. They seemed so certain, so sure of their place in the world. They knew where they belonged. David had no idea where he belonged, and that realization was both terrifying and liberating at the same time. As the days passed, he found himself spending more time reflecting. The simple act of slowing down, of pausing for just a moment, brought his feelings into sharper focus. He began to realize that it wasn't just about wanting something more. It was about finding out who he really was. For so long, he had buried his true desires, pushing them aside in favor of security and comfort. But now, he couldn't ignore them any longer. He wasn't sure what it would take to find the answers, but he knew that he couldn't keep living like this. It wasn't about making a dramatic change overnight or throwing everything away. It was about taking the first step, just one step toward something different, something real. As he walked home that evening, he looked at the city around him, the familiar streets, the same faces, the same stores. It was all so familiar, yet it felt strange to him now. He realized that it wasn't the city or the people that were the problem. It was the fact that he had been living in a bubble of comfort, avoiding the discomfort of change. He had been afraid of stepping outside the lines, afraid of making a mistake, but now something had shifted inside him. He was ready to face whatever came next, ready to take that first step. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But he was ready to start the journey toward finding himself. The first step was acknowledging that he wanted something more, and that realization, in itself, felt like a victory. David woke up the next day with a weight still sitting on his chest. It wasn't a physical pain, but an emotional heaviness that lingered, like an unfinished thought that kept trying to break through. He had gone through the motions of his usual routine, but something had changed. That feeling that had been brewing inside him wasn't going away. It was growing. As he sat in his car, staring at the road ahead, he thought about the days that had passed since that evening with his friends. The disconnection he had felt had stayed with him. And it wasn't just about his job or his routine anymore. It was deeper than that. He realized he hadn't really been living. He had just been existing. He hadn't been truly present in his own life for a long time, and now it was impossible to ignore. David had always considered himself practical. He had always chosen the safe route, the path that was secure, predictable. But the thought of living a life that was always safe, always controlled, didn't seem so appealing anymore. The world outside, with all its chaos and unpredictability, suddenly felt more alive than the life he had been leading. The thought of taking risks, of stepping outside the small bubble he had created, felt both terrifying and exciting. He parked his car and sat for a moment, breathing in deeply. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel something. Anything. He felt the weight of the decision that was forming inside him. The decision to change. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be simple, but it was necessary. That evening, David walked through the park again, the same path he had taken so many times before. This time, it felt different. He wasn't just walking through it, he was seeing it. He could hear the rustling of the leaves in the trees, the distant laughter of children, the sound of a couple talking softly as they walked hand in hand. Everything felt more vibrant, more real. It was as if his senses had been awakened from a long slumber. He paused by the fountain, watching the water splash gently against the stone. It was quiet here, peaceful. David closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to feel the stillness of the world around him. But in the silence, something inside him stirred. A quiet determination. He knew now that he couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't keep ignoring the feelings that had been building up inside him for so long. He had to do something about it. He didn't know exactly what that something was, but he knew it was time to take the first step. The next few days were a blur of thoughts and emotions. David couldn't focus at work, couldn't shake the feeling that he was drifting, but instead of pushing those feelings away, he allowed himself to sit with them. He didn't have to have all the answers right now. He just needed to acknowledge what he was feeling. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to question his choices, to wonder if there was more to life than the steady, predictable path he had been following. He spent his lunch breaks walking around the city, looking at the people around him with new eyes. He watched as strangers passed by, each one with their own story, their own life. It was strange to think that all of these people, so different from one another, were living their own journeys just like he was. He had always thought of his life in terms of small individual moments, work, family, friends, but now he saw it as part of a much larger story, one that was still unfolding. David began to realize that he had been afraid for so long, afraid of taking risks, afraid of failure, afraid of change. But the fear that had kept him stuck in place for so long was beginning to lose its grip. He wasn't ready to make drastic changes just yet, but he knew now that he couldn't stay where he was. He had to start moving, even if it was just a small step. Part 4. A week passed, and David couldn't stop thinking about what he had decided. The weight on his chest hadn't completely lifted, but he felt lighter. It was as though he had finally taken a breath after holding it in for too long. The fear of the unknown still lingered, but now it wasn't as overwhelming. He felt ready to start making changes, even if they were small ones. One evening after work, David sat down at his kitchen table with a notebook. He hadn't written in a while, but something told him this was the time to start. He began to write down his thoughts, his fears, his hopes, his dreams. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to think about what he truly wanted, not what was expected of him, not what others thought he should do, but what he wanted for himself. He wrote about the life he imagined, the one where he wasn't just going through the motions, but living with purpose. He wrote about taking risks, about stepping into the unknown, and embracing the discomfort that came with change. He wrote about the things he had been afraid to acknowledge, the things he had buried deep inside, thinking they weren't important. As he wrote, David felt a sense of clarity that had been absent for so long. The act of putting his thoughts on paper helped him organize his feelings. gave him a sense of control over something that had once felt out of his reach. It was a small act, but it felt like a breakthrough. He wasn't just waiting for life to change. He was choosing to change it himself. The next day, he made his first small change. Instead of following his usual routine, he took a different route to work. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. It was a small act of rebellion against the monotony he had lived with for so long. The next day, he did the same. He began to notice the little things, the way the light hit the buildings, the sounds of the city that he had never paid attention to before. It was as if he were seeing the world for the first time, as though his eyes had been opened to the beauty that had always been there. David didn't know where this journey would take him, but he knew he was on the right path. He didn't have all the answers yet, and he didn't need them. The important thing was that he was finally moving forward. The fear of the unknown still lingered, but it didn't feel so suffocating anymore. It was just a part of the journey, a reminder that growth came with discomfort. In the days that followed, David began to feel a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it was enough. He had stopped waiting for life to change and had started taking the steps to change it himself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he was ready to walk it. The days that followed felt different, not in any dramatic way, but in the way things often do when you start paying attention. David found himself noticing the small things, like the way the sun cast shadows through the trees, or how the world seemed just a little quieter on his early morning walks. There was a sense of calm in the simplicity of these moments. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was truly living in the present. It wasn't that all of his problems were suddenly solved. No, the feeling of restlessness still lingered, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It was more like a distant hum that he could choose to pay attention to or ignore. And for once, he felt empowered to make that choice. David hadn't made any grand, life-changing decisions yet, but small changes were starting to add up. He started rearranging his living space, just moving a few things around, making the place feel less cramped, more open. It was a subtle change, but it gave him a sense of control over his environment. He began spending his weekends exploring new places, trying things he hadn't allowed himself to experience before. Whether it was a new cafe in town or a hiking trail just outside the city, he started taking chances. The biggest shift, however, was in how he approached his relationships. He started having deeper conversations with the people around him. His friends, once a familiar group with predictable conversations, became something more. He reached out to them, not with the intention of filling the silence, but to connect on a real, honest level. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes it was awkward or uncomfortable, but it felt more meaningful. David started talking more openly about his feelings. Instead of bottling everything up, he let the people around him know when something was bothering him. And to his surprise, they listened. They didn't judge him or try to fix things. They simply listened, which in itself was something David hadn't fully appreciated before. He realized how much he had taken for granted in his relationships, how much he had hidden from them and from himself. Opening up wasn't as scary as he had thought, and it made him feel more connected to those who cared about him. There were still moments when the fear crept back in, when the doubts came rushing in, telling him that maybe he was making a mistake, or that he wasn't really changing at all. But these moments were shorter now. He learned to acknowledge them, to let them pass without letting them control his actions. The fear wasn't gone, but it wasn't in the driver's seat anymore. One evening, David found himself sitting on his balcony, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the soft light fading into twilight. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He had spent so many years rushing through life, trying to meet expectations and chasing after goals that never felt quite right. But tonight, there was no rush, no pressure, just the quiet hum of life happening around him, and for once, he was content to be a part of it. It wasn't that David had all the answers now. He still didn't know exactly where this journey would lead him, and that was okay. What mattered was that he had started. He had taken the first step toward understanding himself, and that was enough for now. In the weeks that followed, David's life continued to evolve. The changes weren't always visible on the outside, but on the inside, he felt different. He felt more present, more awake. He realized that it wasn't about changing everything at once. It was about making small, intentional choices every day. He didn't need to have everything figured out to be happy. In fact, the more he let go of the need to control everything, the more freedom he felt. Life wasn't about finding the perfect answer or getting everything right. It was about being open to the journey, about embracing the uncertainties along the way. David knew there would still be challenges ahead. There would still be days when he felt uncertain, when the fear tried to take hold again. But now he understood that those moments didn't define him. What mattered was how he responded to them. He had learned that true growth didn't come from avoiding discomfort. It came from leaning into it, from facing it head on, and using it as a stepping stone. He wasn't the same person he had been just a few months ago. He had changed, not because of any major event or sudden revelation, but because he had started to truly see himself for who he was, and that in itself was a powerful realization. David leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the evening air. He thought about the path ahead, the unknown that stretched out before him. It no longer felt as intimidating. It felt like an opportunity, a chance to keep growing, learning, and becoming the person he had always been capable of being. And as he sat there, watching the world slowly darken, David realized something important. Change didn't have to be something big or dramatic. Sometimes it was the smallest shifts that made the biggest difference. It was the decision to start living fully, to stop waiting for life to happen, and to take charge of your own story. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he was excited to find out.